By a prophet, how God used Ellen White to guide our church. Hosea 12, verse 13 says, "By a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, and by a prophet he was preserved." Now, if God did that for ancient Israel, we could also say that as we look back, we can see how he has done that for us as Seventh-day Adventists as well. By a prophet, he has guided us and preserved us. And today I'd like for us to review some of the ways in which God has done that very thing, how he brought the Seventh-day Adventist Church out of its origins in the Millerite movement, and how he has preserved us. So, after the disappointment of 1844, when Jesus did not come when the believers expected him to, really, in many ways, things began to fall apart. The Millerite movement did. A number of, probably the majority of the Millerite believers, eventually, those that did not give up their faith entirely, gathered together in what became the Advent Christian Church. And they essentially said, well, we believe that Jesus is coming, but we have no confidence in the not predictions, but the calculations of William Miller and the things that he had done. Among those who were not quite prepared to do that after the disappointment, the numbers really were very few. And they had rather bleak prospects as well. Miller had been quite thoroughly discredited by events, and of course people had ridiculed him all the way along. And so it was not popular to say, we believe that Miller had it right in some respect. And so we had very humble beginnings, very few believers who were willing to commit to that kind of set of beliefs. We had almost no money. We had no unity on doctrine. We had Hiram Edson, who was beginning to study out the sanctuary from the Bible with two of his friends, and they published an article about it in a Millerite paper, but their ideas found no instant, widespread support. Joseph Bates was learning about the Sabbath and beginning to promote it in the year or two after the disappointment. And he began then trying to convince James White and Ellen Harmon that they ought to keep the Sabbath. She didn't see much light in it right away. She said, "Brother Bates, you're making a great deal out of this one commandment. There are 10 commandments, not just one." But Bates wrote a pamphlet about the Sabbath and published it and made sure that a copy of it got to the Whites. And the Bible evidence that he presented in that pamphlet convinced them to keep the Sabbath about the time that they were married in 1846. Now this picture is a bit later than that, but that's James and Ellen White. 7 months after she began to keep the Sabbath, Ellen White had a vision that confirmed that they were doing the right thing to honor God's Sabbath. But what could God do, really, with so few believers and while they were so poor? I'd like for us to talk about God's first priority for this group. Dr. Roger Kuhn, who worked with the Ellen G. White estate back when I first joined it, identified what he thought were God's first 3 priorities for this group. And I like what he said there. I'm going to share that with you today, too. That for the decade of the 1840s, God's first priority was doctrine. They needed to have correct doctrine, certainly, and they needed to have unity on that doctrine. How would the Lord bring that about? Well, again, Hiram Edson and his friends were continuing to study the sanctuary and were getting a good grasp of the truths about it. The Whites and Joseph Bates were teaching about the Sabbath. But they still needed to understand some key Bible issues before going further. And some of those early brethren met together to study together many nights, sometimes whole nights, studying and praying. Mrs. White met with them but she said that she could not contribute to the discussion. During this time, she didn't understand what the others were saying and what they were studying. She said that her mind was locked, as it were, and that it was a great sorrow to her that she could not follow the lines of reasoning that they were developing. But when they reached a point, when the others reached a point where they said, we just can't go any further, we can't see our way how to proceed from here, she would be given a vision with a clear explanation of the text that they had been studying. And everyone could see that this was a clear explanation of the text that they'd been studying. They didn't accept it simply because she said so. They accepted it because they could see it in the passages. And so they found that they could unite and they could move forward in their study from those points. God used his prophet to help them understand as they earnestly searched the Bible. And later, she said that later her mind was opened and she was able to understand these things. But in the formation of doctrine, we didn't get our doctrines from Ellen White, but the Lord used her to help point the others in the direction they needed to go in their Bible study so that they could make sense of what they were studying and they could develop the doctrines that we hold today. And so on this matter of doctrine, we could say with Hosea, by a prophet, God has led us and preserved us. Well then, once this little group had a clear idea of at least what some of the doctrines were, what could they do to share that with other people? How could they take those messages to others who had not given up their faith in the Millerite movement? Well, they did so by means of meetings that we usually call Sabbath conferences. Maybe a better name for them might be Sabbath and Sanctuary conferences, because the topics that they covered involved more than the Sabbath. They certainly involved the sanctuary. And these meetings were held in various places from 1848 to 1850. Now the leaders went out, James and Ellen White, Joseph Bates, Hiram Edson, perhaps some others, and met with whoever they could get together in these various locations. Little groups scattered here and there. 20 here, maybe 30 there, maybe as many as 50 in another place. And they presented the truths they had found. They dealt with questions and objections. They studied and prayed with these people who were attending. And by 1850, we had a clear set of doctrines on the main issues, and we had unity on those doctrines. But now, how could they take the message any further? Travel was costly, and they'd found that they could reach only a few people at a time when they went to a particular location. James White had no support from a church or anything at this time. We had no church. James White worked with his hands to support himself and his family. We know of an occasion on which he mowed hay. Now that's with one of those Father Time scythes. You know what I'm talking about here? He mowed 100 acres of hay and was paid 87.5 cents an acre for that work. On another occasion, he worked for the railroad where they were making a cut to lay new track through some rock. He was one of those who hauled the rock out after they had blasted it. And James White knew what it was to work hard physically, to earn money, to support himself and his family. But it didn't allow for much luxury, certainly not much getting around to visit this place or that place. So what could they do to get the message out further than they had already? Well, in 1848, Ellen White received a vision that James was not to do that kind of work anymore. God had a different plan for him. What he was to do was to start a paper. It would be small at first, but it would succeed from the beginning. It would grow, and it would become like streams of light that would go clear around the world. Now think of how that must have sounded to them in 1848, when they could hardly get around New England. Streams of light clear around the world. It was the next year, 1849, before James White felt clear about embarking on that project. but he wrote the articles that were needed for it and carried them, walked actually about 9 miles into town in Middletown, Connecticut, to locate a printer, and got the printer to print 1,000 copies on credit, because he had no money to pay for it up front. And then they sent these out. And that was the beginning of our publishing work. It was a paper that was called Present Truth. So it was in response to a vision that James White began to publish. He had to have vision of his own to see what could be done and to grasp it and to move ahead. But it was Ellen White's vision from God that gave him that impetus to begin the publishing work. And it has indeed grown and become like streams of light that have gone clear around the world. Today we have, I think, more than 60 publishing houses all around the world that publish Adventist literature. It had its beginning here with a vision from Ellen White. And so here again, in the matter of doctrine, but specifically in the matter of the starting of institutional work, publishing work, we would say again with Hosea, by a prophet, God has led us and preserved us. So that's the 1840s, God's first priority, doctrine. What next? Well, Dr. Kuhn identified what he felt was God's second priority, and that was for the next decade, for the 1850s. This kind of dominated our experience in the 1850s, and it had to do with organization. On December 13 of 1850, Ellen White wrote, "We know now that we have the truth. The doctrines were firmly established, at least in their rudimentary form. We would go on and develop them more, but we had a core doctrine by the end of 1850. 11 days later, after she wrote that, on December 24, 1850, she received her first vision on the urgent need for what she called gospel order, by which she meant organization. Now, why did we need to organize? Well, to do a number of important things. To own church property as a group, not just by individuals. To define doctrinal positions officially. To have standards for church membership and be able to apply them, make them stick. To discipline church members when that was needed. To provide for financial support for workers. To establish institutions such as publishing, health, and education. To enter new fields, to open new church work. These are benefits that organization would bring. And yet, the believers resisted organizing. They felt that if they organized, they would become just like the other churches that had rejected the leading of God in the Millerite movement. They would become Babylon just by the very act of organizing. So they thought. Well, Mrs. White's visions urged gospel order, organizing. In 1850, that vision in 1850, she was shown that heaven is orderly and that we should be orderly, and if we were, we would be successful. The next year, 1851, she was shown the need to disfellowship some unruly church members, and that God's frown would be on the church. I'm using the word church even rather loosely here because they weren't organized yet into a church. But God's frown would be on the believers until it was done. In 1854, another vision said that gospel order was too much feared and neglected. It highlighted the problem of unqualified workers going out supposedly representing this new movement. It showed that the church needed standards, and it made clear that the New Testament was a model of church organization. And it showed the need to enter new fields. And by the way, you can read this, the account of this vision in early writings, pages 97 to 107. Well, we took our first formal steps in organization on May 13, 1860, right at the end of the decade of the 50s, where the emphasis had been so strong for organization. The first steps in actually organizing happened in 1860 May 13, 1860, with the first legal organization of a local church. That was the church in Parkville, Michigan. That church, by the way, was rescued from demolition and was physically moved from Parkville to Battle Creek to become a part of the historic Adventist village in Battle Creek. And the church has been restored now, and you can see it, you can hear the stories of what happened there, including one of Ellen White's Civil War visions took place in that Parkville church. But they were the first to organize as a local church. Later that year, October 1, 1860, we adopted the name Seventh-day Adventist. And on the same day, we also organized our first legal body, the Seventh-day Adventist Publishing Association. The next year, 1861, October 5 and 6, we organized our first conference, the Michigan Conference. And nearly 2 years later, on May 21 of 1863, when there were now, I've forgotten if it was 6 or 7 conferences, we organized a general conference to be kind of an umbrella over them. And so these were steps that we took in organization. They were a long time coming, but it was the visions of Ellen White really that moved the church in that direction. Organization probably would not have happened, or at least certainly it would not have happened as soon without the visions of Mrs. White. And what a blessing organization has been to us. It has protected us doctrinally. It has helped us grow and expand. And organization is what has enabled me to travel a couple thousand miles to come here and be with you. Organization is what has made it possible for us to get this facility, to hold this meeting together. We've had many benefits of organization. And so in the matter of organization, too, we would say with Hosea that by a prophet God has led us and preserved us. And this brings us now to the what Dr. Kuhn referred to as God's third priority. And he designated the decade of the 1860s for this. God's third priority, health. Just 16 days after the General Conference organized, after we had our organization kind of nailed down, at least at the beginning, Ellen White had her first major vision on health. That was June 6, 1863. Now, she'd had some earlier instruction on health. In fact, the earliest that we know of goes back to 1848, when she was warned against 3 things. Tobacco, you would probably have guessed that one, but you might not have guessed the other 2. Tobacco, tea, and coffee. Those were the subjects of the first instruction that God gave to Ellen White on the matter of health, warning us against those substances. In 1851, another vision warned again about tobacco. And February 12, 1854, Ellen White received a vision in which God called for cleanliness among his people. We should have clean bodies. We should care for our clothing. It should be clean. It should be neat, whether we are rich or poor. And the vision also said that we should avoid rich food. We should eat simple food, free from grease. Now, the term grease in that era was the word for animal fat. Simple food, free from grease.
Excuse me, I have another question. I can't remember. Did James White stop smoking because of her visions, or had he always stopped before that?
The question was whether James White stopped smoking because of the visions. I don't recall that James White ever smoked. He may have. I just don't remember that. One who did was J.N. Loughborough, who was actually prescribed by a doctor to smoke cigars for a lung ailment that he had. That was the state of medicine at that time. But the Lord warned against tobacco through the visions of Ellen White. Now, in 1863, this major health reform vision that she had, just after we finished the thing about organization, this major vision repeated the instruction of those earlier visions, and it added more to it. It said that the care of health is a religious duty that we have. The Bible itself says that you are to glorify God in your body. And the vision pointed out that we have a responsibility to God for our health. The vision said that disease comes from violating the laws of health. It called for temperance in avoiding tobacco, stimulating drinks, highly spiced foods, overwork, and such things. It offered counsel on diet. An important aspect of this is that it said, don't eat the pig. Don't eat swine's flesh. Now, it was not a whole doctrine about unclean meats. It wasn't that. It was just a warning, don't eat the pig. The rest of that would come later with Bible study. But right now, God warned his people against probably the most common and really one of the more dangerous of the unclean foods, in mercy to them. And the vision recommended the vegetarian diet. And what's more, it said that we should not overeat or eat in between meals. It talked about personal cleanliness, cleanliness of body, of clothing, of living quarters. And it warned about the dangerous drugs of that time. And it urged that we use simple, natural ways of treating disease. And there were other issues as well, but these are the major ones. Now, when Mrs. White showed that the care of health was a duty that we had to God, it gave power to her calls to change our habits, change our practices. You know, if somebody tells you, if you make this change in the way that you're living and stop doing something that you really like to do, you may live 5 or 10 years longer down at the end of your life. Well, that might have some appeal, but particularly if you're quite young at the time, you may think, oh, that's a long way off. I don't have to worry about that. I can worry about that much later. And you may tend to ignore the counsel. But when we see it in terms of our relationship to God, that what we do with our health affects our relationship to God, because after all, the health of the body affects the mind, and it is the mind in which we have communication with God. He communicates with us, and we with him. Then what we do with the body matters in our relationship with God. And God calls upon us to preserve the body in the best health that we can. Not just for our own benefit in terms of long life and such, but in terms of relating to him. So when she showed that this was a duty that we had to God, it gave power to her calls to reform health practices. On December 25, 1865, Mrs. White had a vision that we should have our own health care institution where we could help our own people regain health and we could witness to others. And the church responded remarkably and quickly. In just 9 months from the time that she had that vision, we had constructed the Western Health Reform Institute that you see pictured here, which later was greatly enlarged and became world famous as the Battle Creek Sanitarium. From this beginning, we now have hospitals and clinics in many countries of the world. Now, in the 1860s, Mrs. White also began to warn against alcoholic drinks. And God gave instruction through the visions, instruction that has blessed us, where we have followed those instructions, some that I've just listed for you here, and others that have come as well. Where we've followed these instructions, Seventh-day Adventists have better health and longer life than other people in the general population do. God wants us to be a light to others, showing them that God's ways really are best. And so in the matter of health, not only ways of practicing better health for ourselves, but in the matter of establishing health institutions, we can see again and say with Hosea that by a prophet, God has led us and preserved us. So these three things, doctrine, organization, and health, were apparently God's first three priorities, major priorities, for his prophet to bring to the people. In later years, we find that God used Mrs. White to accomplish many other important things for his church. We're not going to give them numbered priorities like we did these, but I'm going to call your attention to a number of them. Beginning in the 1870s and onward, education was an important emphasis. Now, we've highlighted, a major health reform vision in relation to health, of course. But in relation to education, we don't have one major vision like that one that we had with health. Rather, there were a number of visions that came along that pointed in this direction. And one of the first really significant ones is it's published in volume 3 of the Testimonies, a 30-page article published in 1872. And the call for establishing a school occurs on the very last page of the article, the very last page. But it was the beginning. And there are other articles as well. I've highlighted a couple of them for you here on the screen, in which Ellen White called for us to establish educational institutions for our young people. She called for us to establish a school to train workers for God's cause. Now, this school was not to offer an impractical education like you would get in every other school in the land, in which you would study the classics of Greek and Latin and such. No, that was not what she was shown. Instead, this school, the education in this school, was to center on the Bible and was to provide training for practical living as well. And we find in this call for a school to be established along these lines, we find here the concept of training the whole man, not just the head, but the hand and the heart as well. In response to Ellen White's call as a result of her visions, the church established Battle Creek College in 1874. That's a picture of the first building, Battle Creek College. Now, when the leaders took the steps to do that, the Whites were actually away. They were out of town at the time. And instead of buying the 40-acre tract outside of town, that was the former fairgrounds that Ellen White wanted them to buy, they thought that was too far away. Now, it's probably less than a mile from where they were located out to that fairgrounds, but that just seemed too far away. There were 12 acres right there in town that were much more convenient, and that was what they decided to buy. And then, after they had bought those 12 acres, they thought, what on earth are we going to do with 12 whole acres? Well, let's recoup some of our money. We'll sell off some of the land for people to build houses on near the school. And when the Whites returned and found what had been done, they were greatly disappointed. But it was a beginning. It was a beginning, and they supported it for that reason. And by the way, the education that they ended up offering in that school was just like all the other colleges, with focusing on the classics. There wasn't even one required Bible class. They did offer Bible classes, but they were not required. Now, if you remember anything about your own schooling, if a course was not required, how likely were you to take it? When you had the other ones that were, that were competing for the time. So it was far from ideal, but it was a start. It was a start, and it was in response to the visions that Ellen White had had. Now, when Ellen White went to Australia in 1891, she determined to try to do things there the way she'd been shown they ought to be done. And so she encouraged the leaders to look for a large tract of land away from the city. In fact, she was given a vision of the land that they ought to purchase. It was land that the angel said had been poorly spoken of. That is, people did not regard this land well. But it would grow things very well if it were treated properly. And in the vision, she saw a furrow, a place where a plow had just turned over the soil for maybe about 6 feet there to examine the soil. And they found that place. They found that furrow. And under great difficulty, they bought this tract of land. It was rather large. It was, I think, something like 2,000 acres of land that they were able to purchase. And it became Avondale College, which is still going today. Ellen White built her home there, not on the school property. She didn't want that done, but outside the school property. She bought property and built a home there. And she urged that they carry out the Bible-centered, practical education that she'd been instructed about before. And they decided to do it. They did, and it was a great success. Now, meanwhile, while she's in Australia, other leadership has come to the Battle Creek College. And they determined to try to reform that college. The school was entirely too cramped there in Battle Creek. And so E.A. Sutherland, the president, began looking around for another site where they could relocate. And he found a location about 80 miles away in a town called Berrien Springs, Michigan. And the school moved there, the college moved there in 1901, and they determined to follow Ellen White's, we'll call it Avondale plan, all right? To follow the pattern that was established there at Avondale. To have agriculture and other work, and to let the Bible be the center of the education. Not all of the education by any means, but to be the center of the education that was offered to them. And so we see things beginning to develop in the educational line. But we've really only been talking about college so far. What about the other levels of schooling? Well, we had a few small elementary schools early and one small high school early before Ellen White's visions. But in response to the visions, of course, Battle Creek College was established, and more elementary and high schools followed, along with other colleges. Now, take a look here at the listing here of schools. In 1890, we had a total of 9 schools. In 1895, by 1895, we had doubled that to 18. Now, Ellen White is in Australia, and while she's there, she has a vision that says that a church ought to establish a school for its children. Even if they had as few as 6 children, they should establish a school. Look what happens in the next 5-year period, where we had 18 in 1895. By 1900, we have 220 schools. There's an explosion of schools in response to the visions. And by 1905, another 5-year period, we've doubled that pretty nearly. So the educational work is really rolling here as a result of the visions that Ellen White received. You know, the guidance that Ellen White has given for our schools has remained helpful down to this day. And we need to put our young people into our own schools. The schools of the world will win them to the world. Amen. Our schools are not perfect, we know that. But in Adventist schools, we can at least make the effort to train them to live for Christ in this world. And so in the educational line, again, we're reminded of Hosea's statement back there in Hosea 12:13. By a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, and by a prophet he was preserved. And we can say of our experience in the educational line, by a prophet God has led us and preserved us. All right, also in the 1870s, we began mission outreach, and that continues down to this day as well. The Bible says, go into all the world and preach the gospel, Mark 16:15. But back in our early days, when we had so few members and so little money, we couldn't see how we could actually go into all the world. And some of our early leaders, recognizing the fact that America is really an immigrant country, it's made up of people who have come here from all other parts of the world, it seems. They thought for a time that if we simply evangelized the people in America, we would be getting representatives of people from all over the world, and that would fulfill the gospel commission. Well, that's kind of lame, isn't it? But it was the best that they could see that they could really accomplish at the time. But we did begin to send literature to faraway places. And it indeed has become like streams of light that have gone clear around the world. Now, a European man named Michael Tchaikovsky became a Seventh-day Adventist here in the United States. And then he returned back to Europe as a self-appointed missionary for Adventist doctrines, a missionary to Europe. Now, literature was doing its work too, and soon appeals began arriving back in Battle Creek at the center of the work. Appeals began arriving there for the General Conference to send workers. Now, Europe was in fact the first place we thought we might be able to help, and Mrs. White encouraged it. And in 1874, we sent our best scholar, J.N. Andrews, to Switzerland to start official mission work in Europe. Ellen White said, "We sent the best man we had." And Andrews began publishing in French. He helped to organize the work in Europe. He helped to train others to carry it on. He contracted tuberculosis there. And having given everything he had to the work, his health, his money, his daughter, who had already died of tuberculosis there, that is, she contracted it there, and finally he gave his life to begin mission work in outside of the U.S., in Europe. And other missionaries followed with Ellen White's encouragement and urging. In 1875, she had a vision of work in many places of the world. When she came out of the vision, she couldn't remember what all of them were, but she did remember that Australia had been one of them. She went to Europe herself in 1885 and stayed there for 2 years until 1887, helping and encouraging the work there in Europe. She recognized places in Europe that she had seen in the earlier vision, and even recognized some workers that she had seen in that vision, had a message to give them. And Africa and other parts of the world began to receive missionaries too. In 1891, Ellen White herself responded to the call of the church to go as a missionary. She went to Australia and helped to start new work there. She spent 9 years there, returning to America in the year 1900. And so by her messages from her visions, and also by her own example, Mrs. White encouraged the mission outreach of the church. And so in missions also, we would say, by a prophet, God has led us and preserved us. Now in the 1880s and the 1890s, we experienced a revival of a Christ-centered message. When this church began, our pioneers knew that we are saved by faith in Jesus, not by works. But they had a message to give, a message of present truth. And a part of that present truth, in fact, a main point of it, is that God wanted people to obey His law, including keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And gradually then, this became the focus of much of our preaching, until, in effect, we were saying, oh yes, you are saved by grace if you keep the law. Well, law-keeping is very important. But it is not what saves us in any way. Not in any way. Jesus only is our Savior. If we ever reach heaven, it will be because He saved us with His blood, not because we kept the law. Now, we keep the law because He has saved us, and He enables us to keep it. Mrs. White observed that as a people, we have preached the law until we are as dry as the hills of Gilboa that had neither dew nor rain. We must preach Christ in the law, she said. We must not trust in our own merits at all, but in the merits of Jesus of Nazareth. In the early 1880s, she was emphasizing Jesus as our Savior and Redeemer, urging us to trust only to Him. Around the same time, E.J. Wagoner and A.T. Jones began to preach a similar message. And this all came to a focus at the 1888 General Conference session. And the tide began to turn as more ministers and people caught a glimpse of what Ellen White called the matchless charms of Jesus. In 1892, Mrs. White published her little book, Steps to Christ, presenting the way to salvation and victory through faith in Jesus. I want to tell you, that book changed my life when I was a teen. When I really was struggling, I wasn't even sure that there was anything real about this Christian life and the supposed power of Jesus, because I didn't see it in my life. And it was that book that turned my life around. I'll be forever grateful to the Lord and Ellen White for that book, Steps to Christ. In the 1890s and 1900s, we went through a period of reorganization. When we first organized, we had a pretty simple structure. We had churches, and then we had conferences, and then we added a general conference over the conferences. And that worked well for quite some time. But as the church grew, as the work grew, we outgrew that structure. Most of the authority to do things and to spend money rested with a few men in Battle Creek. And it took far too long to get their permission, particularly if you were in Australia or Africa or some far-off place like that. And what's more, they didn't always understand the needs of the work in those far-off places. In fact, it got so bad that some parts of the church were actually considering breaking off from the General Conference and establishing their own General Conference. There are other denominations, that have done that. They have the church. Their churches are organized only by regions or by individual countries instead of being really united. And we could have gone that route, but that was one of the things that seemed to be shaping up. A related problem was what Ellen White called kingly power. These few men in Battle Creek liked being in charge of everything. And what's more, they often, it seems, did not reflect Jesus in their administration. Also, we needed a better way of organizing things like publishing work, medical work, educational work. A better way of organizing those, and a better way of sending missionaries. This surprised me when I learned it, but in our early days, those things, the institutional work and the sending of missionaries, those things were not done by the church. They were done by organizations that were organized independently to do those things. Missionary societies, publishing associations, but they were not an integral part of the church. And so, as the delegates came to the 1901 General Conference session, they knew that something had to change. When the session began, just after the opening remarks, Ellen White made her way up to the front and addressed the delegates. And she called for reorganization under different lines from what we had done up to that point. She called on the leaders themselves as well to be thoroughly converted before they tried to administer God's work. And the leaders took the challenge seriously. They set aside all the other business of the session, and they went to work to find a better way. And at the end of the session, they had made several major changes. One, they put into place another level of administration called the Union Conference to meet the needs of workers closer to where they were actually doing the work. This was something that they had already tried in Australia and found it to be successful and helpful. No longer did they have to send all the way back to the General Conference at Battle Creek to get permission to do anything, to make any decision. Second, they organized departments for the church to oversee those things that we talked about: medical work, educational, publishing, and while it may not be a department, they also brought the sending of missionaries into the church structure itself. Now, the departmental idea had been tried first in Africa under A.T. Robinson's administration there, and they'd found it to be successful there. And so the 1901 General Conference session adopted it for the World Church. And they expanded the General Conference Committee from 3 men, small, very small committee. They expanded it to 25 and more, so that the work would have the benefit of many minds and wide experience. And Ellen White was thrilled with the changes that they had made. She said angels had been walking up and down these aisles, influencing the session for good. Now later we would expand the structure even more. We would create divisions to oversee the work in various parts of the world, oversee various groupings of unions. But Mrs. White's call for reorganization and her approval of what they did have helped the church greatly. God did not reveal to her the exact outline of just what they were to do, but he pointed the way with the visions, and then he led his appointed leaders in finding the best way to move forward. And so on this matter of organization and reorganization, again we would say with Hosea, by a prophet, God has led us and preserved us. And we haven't even touched on how God used Mrs. White to save the church from theological error. Besides the doctrinal help that he gave at the beginning, and besides the help in the 1888 righteousness by faith message that we've mentioned, God enabled Ellen White to help us understand that Jesus was eternal, just like the Father, and that the Holy Spirit is a person. Both of these were rather high hurdles for many of our early believers to take. Most of them believed that Jesus, in the earliest years, believed that Jesus was God's first created being. Later, they moved a little from that in the right direction to say that Jesus emanated from the Father at some early point. But to hold that Jesus has truly been co-eternal with the Father as a separate being, that came hard. But through Ellen White, we were enabled to begin to really consider that and to look at it. And we found the Bible support for it as well. And so that has been an advance that we've made in terms of our theology. And the belief that the Holy Spirit is a person, not just an influence or a force. This too, we can look to the writings of Ellen White to help us be able to move into that belief. And in the early 1900s, she kept us from adopting pantheism, despite the strong influence of Dr. Kellogg and others. Now there are some other things as well. Her major literary output, look at this, from the 1890s and the 1900s. Patriarchs and Prophets, I've just given the initials here, the abbreviations, because the list would fill the screen. Patriarchs and Prophets, Gospel Workers, the 1892 version, Steps to Christ, Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, The Desire of Ages, all of these important books coming out in the 1890s. And then in the 1900s and 19-teens, Christ's Object Lessons, Education, The Ministry of Healing, The Acts of the Apostles, a revision of the Great Controversy, the final revision of it, a revision of Gospel Workers, Counsels to Parents, Teachers, and Students, Prophets and Kings, finally, that was published shortly after her death. These are major works that have had such an influence on our church and on our understanding of the Bible and of how we can relate to our world. And of course, there's Testimonies for the Church. The 9 volumes span the years 1855 down to 1909. These are just some of the ways in which God has blessed this church through the visions that he gave to Ellen White. Her messages continue to bless the church today. She wrote, "We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." So this is just a quick survey, and I think we could have listed other things as well. But as you look back over the many ways in which the visions of Ellen White have influenced this church, right down to its core. It really is amazing, isn't it? What if we had never had the gift of prophecy through Ellen White? What would we be like today? Probably nothing. We wouldn't have accomplished anywhere near what we have. And we can thank God for what we have been able to do. But let's take these counsels seriously. Let's thank God for them. Let's read them. Let's use them. They'll continue to bless us.